Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Security Repo podcast. Have with us this time Marc Boorshtein. Very happy to have you on the show today. He is the CTO over at Tremolo Security. Marc has been working in the industry for over a decade, working in identity and access management. Has been a software engineer, a product developer, and a consultant. He's got experience building, deploying, and managing identity systems for all major vendors across a bunch of industries. Marc has also spent time deploying identity systems in federal government as well as in the private sector. This experience is what led to the foundation of Tremolo Security's products, and we're going to get into what those products are, Marc, but welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Great to see you again. We met down at CIVO Navigate 2024 down in Austin, Texas this year, and that's where I got the chance to see your talk about dashboard security. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. That's why I invited you onto the show, is the root of the conversation we want to have with you. So let's talk about Kubernetes dashboards. Why on earth did this become a focus for you? At least focus enough to write a talk about it.
So, I come from an enterprise background, and the great thing about enterprise is we love our dashboards, right? Whether you're talking about a Splunk dashboard or a Grafana dashboard, it doesn't really matter. We like our visual things, um, and when I first got introduced to the Kubernetes dashboard was when I first started working with Kubernetes back in 2015, I want to say, with 1.3. You get up and running, and often the first thing people will do is say, now what, right? What does this thing look like? And the great thing about a dashboard is you can quickly see what it looks like. It presents a lot of information to you visually very, very quickly. And so the first thing I did was I got the dashboard working and start pointing and clicking, and okay, I got to do a kube control port forward to be able to access it. And I came at Kubernetes from a little bit of a different background. I started off in the identity management world, particularly in the web SSO world. So if any of your listeners remember the old days of Obelix and SiteMinder and agents, that's the world that I grew up in. And so my first default when I look at a web application is, how do I securely access it with SSO? And that didn't exist at the time. Like that wasn't really a thing. Um, and so that's why I really started to get involved with working with the dashboard team, the Kubernetes dashboard. Specifically, I helped write the code that allowed for it to work on like AWS secure or EKS securely or GKE securely, using impersonation. So it was really a combination of my background coming from the web SSO world, working with web applications to do SSO, and then also just my learning experience in Kubernetes. Like, where do I even begin? How do I look at my cluster? What's that first pop of information that I get once I've got the thing up and running?
So you said something interesting in there, and that is like the first thing you do is modify it with kube control or kube cuddle. Heard it pronounced both ways. Um, but that is how I think most people think about Kubernetes and tools in general. Is like, I'm gonna get in there with command line, maybe hit it up through an API call somehow or another. But dashboards seem to be like the neglected child of this world. I don't hear a lot of people talking about dashboards out there. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't actually know that I would agree with that idea that that's what most people want to do. I think that there is I think that there has definitely been a CLI API stigma on Kubernetes where it's, we're going to use the CLI, we're going to use these local tools to talk directly to the API. Um, but given the chance, I think people love dashboards. I think one of the reasons why dashboards seem to be neglected isn't because people don't want to use them, it's because they're hard to secure. They're hard to deploy securely. They're very easy to do wrong. We hear the Tesla breach is waved every time somebody mentions the Kubernetes dashboard. Tesla, 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 and it's like, well, yes, that Tesla breach happened because somebody deployed a dashboard really poorly. No, that's not the way life has to be. We don't have to live this way. And so what I think has happened is you've had kind of strange uh, this strange effect where the inability to easily secure the dashboard, and it's a dashboard. It's not the Kubernetes dashboard in particular, because there are a bunch of cool ones, right? Like I was talking with the Headlamp team out at KubeCon. They've got a really interesting dashboard. There's like probably 4 or 5 of them out there that are server based. Lens has, I think, has a server based one. Um, but you've got this strange scenario where the people who run Kubernetes clusters are not web application administrators, right? Like they're system admins.
Hmm.
So the stuff that kind of comes second nature to a web admin, where it's like, okay, now I have to do authentication. Now I have to do, SSO, and I have to integrate with our corporate SSO system. I think a lot of the Kubernetes management teams are like, I don't want to have to deal with that. I don't want to have that dependency in my management system. Um, and then combine that with the fact that web access management is really hard to do correctly.
Hmm.
Like, you've got to, think about it from a security standpoint. You've got to maintain some kind of session state. That session state has to be identified in a way that's not easily reproducible because you have a cookie, right? So, like the way we do it in Tremolo is we generate a random string using our secure random generator, and then we encrypt it. So that way there's plenty of entropy there, right? But you don't want to be able to randomly guess it. Like you don't want like a 6-digit number. The easiest way that most dashboards and most systems level applications do this is they say, okay, we're going to encrypt who you are in a cookie. But cookies can only have, what is it, 4K of data? That is not a lot of data. You lose that very, very quickly. Plus, you want to make sure that that data is not reusable, not reproducible. So if I just encrypt, say, your username as an example, right? But I don't include enough in there to make every time you log in different, then that becomes this static password essentially that you can take. And like these are hard problems to solve.
Yeah.
With Kubernetes, it becomes extra difficult because your dashboard needs to interact with the API server. So how is it going to do that? Is it going to do it with a local service account that has privilege? Well, now you get into, was it the dirty deputy, invalid deputy problem um, that Tesla ran into, where their dashboards had privilege, so somebody could just get into the dashboard pod, get the credentials, and then escalate from there. And so the those are really hard problems to solve if you don't come at from the right angle. So the much easier thing to do is say, hey, we're just going to do everything using kube control port forward or kube control proxy. Or you go to the other extreme where you have a lot of local dashboards, right? Where you run as a local application on your system. Except in the security world and the enterprise, we've been screaming about jump boxes for 30 years, right? Like, no, very few system engineers out in the enterprise world can interact directly with their systems. They got to first log into a jump box and then go from there. So now we've just like, and I think there's probably limited security in jump boxes, so it doesn't make me too sad that sometimes has to go away. But that's what we've been preaching in the security world for 20 plus years. And the idea of now saying, okay, we're going to bypass that by letting you have direct access to the API from your system can be an issue. The other problem with a lot of these local dashboards is, especially the web-based ones, where Octant is a great example of this, where they'll pop up a web browser, right? Like it's not a GUI app, pops up a web browser that communicates with a local open port on your system. That local open port has to be unprotected. So while you couldn't go to a web page that has some bad content on it that could manipulate it, like the browser will generally protect you against that. Um, yeah, a bad script will still give you heartburn, right? Because a script could access that open port. So like in the book, I'm the co-author of Kubernetes and Enterprise Guide, which second edition is out now. Third edition is coming out in August or July. We do an entire chapter on the dashboard, and I actually put together a little script that if you're port forwarding the generic Kubernetes dashboard, uses the dashboard's own APIs to deploy a crypto miner. So there are a lot of ways to do this wrong,
Yeah.
but the thing is, when you do it right, it's so beautiful and it works so well, and people end up loving it.
So there's a lot in there to unpack. Because I did want to go into like overall security concerns, and it sounds like you started covering that. But is this the only level of concern we have with dashboard security? Is just the access piece?
Oh no, 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 no. Unfortunately, I mean, because there's getting into the dashboard, but then authorizations, right? Like that's always the hardest problem is authorization. Like authentication is pretty mechanical, but then you get into authorization, and it becomes an even trickier subject because authorizations are generally tied to business logic. Um, we're kind of in a transitionary state right now. I think in the Kubernetes world where uh, we've gone from everybody needs to have their own cluster to that's not the best idea. We need multi-tenancy. And we need to start focusing on multi-tenancy, which has its own headaches, right? How do you then break that up? And that extends to your dashboard. If your dashboard is designed with a single tenant in mind, and now you have multi-tenancy in place, that becomes a big problem. Um, I think the big challenge that I think a lot of dashboards are going to have, and I'm going to call out my friends at Kiali because I love them. Um, excuse me, they built their dashboard to be both multi-tenant and multi-cluster. Well, now we're finding that their code to do it multi-cluster is exposing data via multi-tenancy because of the way that they do their connection management. So it's a very hard problem to solve. But again, once you do solve it, and the tools are out there to solve it, uh, it makes for such a better experience.
Um, uh, I want to jump all the way back to the value of dashboards for people that haven't really explored this, for people that are new to Kubernetes or just about to dip their toe in the water. It always surprised me because you and I have been around for a while. I mean, I'm a gray beard myself, but I've seen a lot of this stuff. But there's a whole world of people who are just dipping their toe into cloud native, just dipping their toe into Kubernetes for the first time, getting to meet them at places like Civo Navigate and other events that I've spoken at. Could you just talk real high level, like what do we mean by dashboard? Like what's the information we're looking for? What's the value of even going down this route?
Yeah. So if you think about what your workload with a cluster might be, you get a kube control configuration, and that's a whole other conversation. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, you got that kube control configuration, and you're getting alerts that an API is down or an application is down. So what's the first thing you want to do? You want to look at something that gives you a quick snapshot of are things running. So if you're going to do that with kube control, you're going to do kube control get pods. Okay, well, all the pods are 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. What you didn't realize was that there was a replica set that failed to initialize because of a new not pod security policy, pod security standard policy. And because the replication set failed to initialize just looking at the number of pods, if you just looked at the pods, everything looks okay because the pods that were allowed to create started. But the pods that weren't allowed to create, that information is not on the pods list. That's going to be either on the replica set or the deployments list.
Let's see.
Whereas if you looked at a dashboard, if you logged into the Kubernetes dashboard and went to the namespace, it's immediately going to show you a little pie chart that has a red that says, hey, one of your replica sets is that. And it's not right. There's some intelligence there. So in what would take a senior person, someone to recognize. And like I ran into this yesterday. So like right now I'm having a lot of fun with a project called Home Lab, where we're building out home labs and making it easier to have a home lab that feels enterprisey. And you know, the I was working on this yesterday, and this great project, Cargo. Go check it out. Um, really fun to be able to contribute to it. Um, the fun thing was that like I was trying to deploy the Kube Prometheus stack, so this is a open source monitoring stack, and like it wasn't succeeding. I couldn't figure out why. And I'm looking at the pods, and the pods are all there. And then I look at the events, and the events are like, oh, yeah, because of pod security standard, the node exporter needs privilege. Right. So, like, as a senior, I knew to do that escalation. But if it was my first day, I'd be like, everything looks fine. The pods are running. What's going on? Like, where do I look? There's so many places to look. So, being able to have that visual representation that says, here are the broken things, right? Like that's the first thing that kind of comes to mind. Resource management. You know, you launch a new application, and you've got to figure out what kind of resource requests you need to have. Well, you can do that via the API. You could sample it and whatever, or you could fire up Grafana after 20 minutes and say, okay, here's the line. You're just getting all that information so much more quickly. In a way that you can do via the API, but you have to know where to look. I think the other nice thing about dashboards is versus uh, um, local API use, there are two additional benefits. One, from an enterprise perspective, distributing enterprise software is difficult. So keeping things up to date is difficult. And then also, like we talked about before with jump boxes, right? That, if you're deploying locally these applications that need to reach via an API, well, now you're bypassing some of the security that you've built into your policy. Uh, but the other thing is also these guys, right? Like
Mobile phones, for those of you
mobile
listening.
phones, tablets, all sorts of different mobile devices. Um, Once you have a dashboard, once you have a web interface that you can securely use, that opens up these things, which, depending on your scenario, might be a blessing or a curse. But like I've got production clusters that I help manage with my customers. And while I was on vacation, I had no problem being able to securely, like not just like, hey, username and password, but using multi-factor hardware-based authentication, get access to the dashboard and say, nope, everything's good. We're not the problem. And that's something that um, I think we can vastly underestimate in the Kubernetes world is the power of being able to quickly access information from these jobbies.
Right on, man. Yeah, we're definitely an interconnected world. But as long as we're doing it safely, it's an exciting future, and that's the scary part about all these peripherals, all these independent third party devices. How do we secure them? Well, turns out there actually is a good path. You were holding an Android device, I noticed there. Yeah, we're Android's pretty dang secure if you do it correctly. Our friend Samsung, who I can't get into, like it's pretty amazing. Like they lock that thing down pretty good. Hey, sort of takes time here. I want to move along the conversation. I want to boil this up a little bit higher, get out of just dashboard security. It's a great topic, but you work a lot with all sorts of clients. There, Tremolo. Why don't you give us the quick high level pitch on Tremolo? Like, what do you focus on? Who are you helping out there in the world? What are you trying to do?
Sure. So, Tremolo Security, we're an open source identity management company. We have had a really nice focus, I think, on Kubernetes for the last 10 years. But we secure anything and everything public safety systems. Did talk at KubeCon in Detroit about a public safety system that we provide security for. Um, uh, uh, Banks are our customers, local governments, federal customers, biomedical. So we're all over the place. Um, and specifically in the Kubernetes world, we have always come from the approach that certificates are bad. Like when you do it right, they're great, but Kubernetes doesn't do certificates correctly. Um, Kubernetes certificates, there's been this open audit item for years. I think for like 3 years at least, since they started auditing the code base of you can't do certificate revocation checking in Kubernetes. So if you grant somebody an identity in a certificate, that's it. Like until the certificate expires, you cannot stop that person. There are some tricks you can do with authorization and RBAC, but that's sort of like the how, the call is coming from inside the house type security. Um, and at least once a month, maybe every 2 months, there's a question on Kubernetes Slack. Hey, we accidentally emailed this master certificate to the wrong person, and we need to revoke it. How do we do that? And the answer is always you have to rekey your entire cluster, which is dangerous and can be fine and can also be incredibly painful. So, the certificates are bad in Kubernetes. And so we come from the standpoint of you want to use token-based authentication, specifically either OpenID Connect or we're big fans of impersonation. So that's where you have a reverse proxy that sits between your user and the API server. The reverse proxy figures out who you are and what you can do, and then tells the API server that. So that gives you the ability to go, whether you're on-prem or you're in a managed cluster like Amazon, Azure, Google, whatnot. Short-lived tokens. So a lot of times we get a token, we say, hey, we want to hold on to this token for like 3 hours, 4 hours. Imagine the damage you could do with a token for 4 hours, right? So we say no 1-minute tokens,
Mhm.
1-minute tokens, right? And just allow the protocol to refresh it. Kube Control knows how to do that. And so we're able to then tell our customers, look, you're getting the best of both worlds. You're getting the easy access that you're looking for, but you're getting it securely. You've got the mitigations in place to be able to get that access. And it doesn't matter if you're talking about an on-prem or a cloud hosted cluster. There was actually there were a bunch of security talks at KubeCon, and one of them talked about common attack vectors. And I want to make sure I don't misquote here, so I'm paraphrasing, but what the speaker said was essentially that um, cloud IAM access is the new initial access vector. So if you've got an EKS cluster and you're using your cloud IAM, that cloud IAM can be a initial attack vector because they're generally overly broad. The people who run those accounts, don't have the same level of tunnel vision that you kind of need on a cluster to be able to lock that down. They tend to be overly broad. So even though the cloud vendors know how to make authentication, right? Like it's not questioning whether Amazon IAM or GKE or uh, uh, Azure have bad authentication. That's not the problem. It's that being able to manage the authorization of that authentication is a really hard thing to do, and asking the cloud team to do that can be a problem, especially when you start talking about multi-tenancy, which is a whole other mess of problems. So we come from the standpoint of don't use cloud IAM to access Kubernetes. They're use give unto the cloud what is the cloud, give unto Kubernetes what is Kubernetes.
Yeah.
And so Kubernetes has its own internal structure. Use it. You're gonna make your life easier that way. And so we've translated that up to the dashboard as well by saying, look, we're going to make it easier for you to use dashboard. So we bundle the Kubernetes dashboard directly with OpenUnison, which is our main open source project for accessing Kubernetes. And pretty much every time we walk into a large company, their security team, the first thing they say is turn off the dashboard. It's insecure. It's Tesla. And we go through all the mitigations that we put in there, and we build in there by default that you as the user don't have to think about at all. Like we just do it
Yeah.
for you. We've automated the whole thing. And they're like, okay, yeah, no, that's kosher. Um, or we'll walk in and the API, the Kubernetes teams will say, oh, we don't need the dashboard. We don't want to use it. It's just something else we have to secure. Say, no, we do it for you for free. Like you get it already. You don't have to do any additional work. Just try it for a week. And without fail, almost every time the response is, yeah, it turns out it's pretty darn useful. And we want to, we're building it into our support process. You know,
The right tools make for light work. They make the right tool in the right situation is eminently helpful. Uh, I'm just would love to hear some war stories from you. Working with all sorts of clients out there, walking in, I bet you have walked into a number of just messes. We don't want you to name names. Don't only keep your client base happy out there. But are there any like egregious things that people need to watch out for, or like common pitfalls you see like again and again as you walk into these organizations?
yeah, I mean, the most common one is sharing that master configuration file, right? Like you walk in, you say, here's the master configuration file. And like that should just be like kryptonite, like radioactive. Like I don't want it. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to touch it. I don't want anybody to think that I ever had it. Um, and it's like, no, we hand it out like candy. And I'm like, okay, well, what happens? Like, I'm a consultant. What happens when I leave? Right. We haven't really gotten that far. Um, that's a big issue. Or, you get to the long-lived tokens where it's like, well, I don't want to have to renew my tokens every couple of minutes. That's a developer workflow that we don't want to do. It's like, well, you don't have to actually do it. You just have to use the system. So that's another one that we run into a lot. Um, MFA or not to MFA. There are a lot of people who say, I don't need MFA. And it's like, yeah, you kind of do. Like, I don't care how many layers you've got between you and like how locked down it is. You should have MFA. And then you get into well, we use, local port forwarding or we use, whatever. That'll happen. I had one customer who was using a competitor of ours that um, a common approach to Kubernetes security is to do port forwarding, but then you're using like the identity of the user isn't making it down into the cluster, right? So like you've got this higher layer of security, and then it's just using a generic service account to talk to the cluster as opposed to, uh, you know, impersonation. And it's like, okay, well, how do you know who's doing what? Well, we go to this tool. I'm like, okay, so now you're bound to that tool, right? Yeah, that's a bad thing. So it's there are a lot of misconceptions about how you do Kubernetes security securely. Um, and a lot of the times the focus in the Kubernetes world, not incorrectly, I don't think, but it's just because it's something that we're good at, or at least we're better at, is on the runtime, the container side, the process isolation, because that's stuff that we're more easily able to control. But then we say, but here's the key to the door. Like we've locked down the supply chain, right? All our containers are signed. We have S bombs for our S bombs, right? Like even our S bombs have S bombs. We have all this stuff, but here's a certificate to get in. Have a nice day. And it's just like, okay, like what am I supposed to be here? Like, is this okay? And that's why I tend to see a lot of is the like, hey, we've spent all this time locking down all these different components of the cluster, and then we hang the key on the front door with a big sign that says, "This is the one that gives you everything."
And a map of everything right underneath it.
Well, and because it's API based, you know, all that information is there.
it seems like there's an uphill battle on this. Do you see this as something like obviously you see it solvable? You're working toward that solve, but uh, in like the short term predictions here, is this something that's going to you think take more mainstream conversation, or will the prevalence of dashboard bad still continue to reign for the next couple years?
I mean, I think there's always going to be a stigma against dashboards. Um, and there will always be a, because that requires a cultural change in the way that we approach our clusters. I think what you're starting to see is a few different things kind of collide that are changing, that are help propelling that cultural change in the way we approach security. One, the move to multi-tenancy, and look, the dirty secret about one of the many dirty secrets about our industry is that we tend to push narratives that our products support, right? So for years, our products didn't support any kind of multi-tenancy. So we said you don't need multi-tenancy. Now our products are starting to support it, and it's like, yeah, we're starting to hear more and more about how multi-tenancy is not a terrible idea anymore. Um, so I think that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is Kubernetes has gone from the startup world to the enterprise. And the enterprise world is very, very different. In the enterprise world, you're dealing with silos in a way that's not true in, and I don't want to say just the startup world, but in the service provider world. If you've got an Uber or a Lyft or a Netflix, there's that one thing that everybody's working to deliver, right? Netflix, it's all about the movie. It's all about the video, right? Everything is about that. And it culminates to that. With Uber, it's getting you into the car, right? Like these are very broad things that everybody's working towards. Whereas in an enterprise, you know, you might have half a dozen people using a system that does something with the widgets in your company. And, if that system goes down, it might not have any material impact on the company. But if your paycheck is based on the uptime of that system, that is the most important system in the world to you.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so the silo effect in enterprises means that the way we control our infrastructure is very different than the way a service provider controls its infrastructure. And if I'm going to be called to task, if my paycheck is going to be impacted by an outage, guess what? I'm going to want to have more control. Because what I don't want to have to do, and I've had to do this, and I know other ops people have had to do this, is walk into a meeting with the CIO when the system is down and say, it's down because of them. Nobody wants to hear it. It just creates a giant blame fest, blame storming session. And nobody wants to be in a position to say, I'm powerless. It's their problem. Right.
Yeah.
And so by those things kind of coming together, you're starting to see a lot of the lessons that we've learned in the web application world around SSO and identity and the importance of that is now coming into the cloud native world. And I think that that's what's really changing the game on how we access Kubernetes and ultimately how we access our dashboards.
Right on. Thanks very much for that. I think you're right. I think the we have been in silos, and the silos continue to be a thing. That's something I've been talking about a lot this year. Is the security silo of like this culture of no that got built up, and everyone, you we need to figure out that in the broader sense. But it's at least healthy to hear that uh, this opinion that we are learning those lessons and we're not starting from scratch completely again in all these fields, and like it's all coming together for a healthier, better future. Thanks for being here. we always like to play a game before we get out of here with all of our guests. The best advice you've ever heard in security and the worst advice you've ever heard. It could be the best advice you've ever given, the best advice that you currently are investigating. Um, but there's always that one piece of bad advice that you've heard at least somewhere along the way, early days, a long time ago, someone told you something. But let's start with the good. What's the best advice that you currently are thinking about?
MFA,
MFA
like
all the way.
MFA, um, and MFA in a way that's not horrible.
Mhm.
Like there's good MFA, and there is absolutely god awful MFA. And without naming names, um, some infrastructure providers that may exist in the Pacific Northwest have some of the worst MFA I've ever had the mispleasure of using. Like push notification MFA is awful. MSS SMS MFA is awful. It makes it, users know how to use MFA now. It's not 2019 anymore where MFA is still kind of a like, why do I need MFA for this? It's like, okay, I'm gonna have to use MFA. I get it. But the push notifications are awful. The numbers that you have to type in are awful. Like it's just a terrible user experience, and I'm not really all that convinced it helps your security. Um, so the best advice is MFA. The worst advice is bad user experience in any security, right? Like when the user experience is good and it's transparent, security is awesome, right? Like the best security you don't see.
Right on.
It's when it's intrusive to your workflow and you have to think about it, and it's just like, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm going to complain. And that bubbles up to the executive level, and the executive's like, well, why do I need a pin on my iPad? And why do I need to use MFA? Well, you're the one who's most likely going to get hit because you have all the power in this company.
Mhm.
So the I would say that's both the best and the worst advice. The best advice I've ever heard is, MFA specifically, but work to make your security usable. There is not a conflict between security and usability. That is a false dichotomy. It means you're not doing it right. So yeah, I would answer both of those questions with the same thing.
Right on. Yeah, I definitely know what you mean with good and bad MFA. Even with the type in of numbers, it's better than nothing, like with Authenticator and those. But on my Mac that I'm recording this on, like just the fact I can touch a hardware based thing that biometric figures it out.
Yep.
Like that workflow, like that takes me nothing. My Google authentication keys, my Titan keys, plug them in, don't think about it, hit the button when it says hit the button, and I'm good. I'm digging those experiences.
Yeah.
So wrapping up here, if people want to follow along with your adventures out in the world, what's the best way for them to do that?
So find me on Twitter. MLBIAM is the best place. Find me on LinkedIn. Whether we've met or not, chances are I'll happily connect. Um, those are probably the two easiest places to find me. I am also on the Fediverse, MLBIAM at infosec.exchange. If you want to find Tremolo is on Twitter at Tremolo at Twitter, and then Tremolo on Hachyderm as well.
Right on. And your book is coming out, you said July, August, the next
July
edition?
or August? I'm a little confused because Amazon, if you look at it, says August. Packet, who's the publisher, says July. So I'm not entirely sure which
Well,
one is which.
we will put links to all of that in the show notes below. So definitely make sure you check it out. And thanks very, very much for being here. Really appreciate you bringing your passion for dashboards onto the show. Not a topic I think we've covered here yet. So really, really excited to have you. And thanks again.
Thanks for having me. I had a blast.